All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to April. Welcome to our April version of Calendar Cooking. And I'm your host, Elizabeth. I'm Elizabeth Coots. I'm the Woodford County Extension Agent for Family and Consumer Sciences. And welcome to April. Welcome to Oops, sorry for the technical version. I think you can just close. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So we are here cooking our April calendar recipe, of course. But as always, if this is your first time joining or watching this segment, welcome. Glad that you are here. We are cooking from this food and nutrition calendar that is here with the Cooperative Extension Service in Kentucky. These calendars are available to you. You can stop by here at the Woodford County Extension Office and pick up a calendar. We have them both in English and in Spanish. Or if you are outside of Woodford County, you can stop by your local county extension office to pick up a calendar for yourself. Each month there is a recipe, and there's lots of other information in this calendar: physical activity, how to reduce sodium in your diet, how to start a garden and when to start planting, how to substitute certain things when you're cooking. And the recipes are also in the back of the calendar as terrible little index card type recipes that you can keep, the ones that you like. So today, since it is the first Wednesday of April, we are going to be making the April recipe. And the recipe this month is pork with greens and beans. So you may have heard of pork and beans, but this is a little different take on that. Of course, we're talking, this is the food and nutrition calendar. So we're talking about making things a little healthier. So with this recipe, we have some other vegetables that are going to be added in, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So I want to tell you the first step in this recipe, the first two steps, excuse me, we have already done. And the reason for that is because this recipe utilizes a slow cooker. So because we don't have 5 hours to sit here on Facebook and watch the slow cooker cook, we have already done that step, but I'm going to tell you what it is. So you take 1 tablespoon of olive oil heated in a skillet, and then you are going to brown 1 pound of boneless pork butt on all sides. You're going to brown that in the skillet, and then you're going to transfer that into your slow cooker. You're going to add 3 cups of chicken broth that is low sodium, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as well as 1 onion that has been sliced. So you're going to put your lid on and you're going to let that cook for 5 hours on low, or until the meat is tender enough to kind of pull apart, and tender enough that you think that, oh, that's going to taste really good. But you also want to use an instant read thermometer and put it down in the meat to make sure that it is at 145 degrees, which is what you want your pork to be cooked at. So before I show you that, I want to talk a little bit about one of the ingredients, the broth. So the recipe does say 3 cups of low sodium chicken broth. And I talk about food labels a lot, and looking at the information that is marketed on a product. So you want to make sure that you see on the front of the package something that says low sodium or less sodium. No added salt is also an option. This one just says less sodium. And of course, if you're ever not sure, or if it seems a little confusing, sometimes what is said on the front of a product can be a little confusing. What does that really mean? Flip it over to the back and look at the nutrition facts label. Not only the nutrition facts label, but also the ingredients. So what you would want to look for in this case is the sodium, and make sure that is either 0 or very low. And if you're not sure, you can always compare it to the original, or you can even compare it to if there's a fat-free or no sugar added product. Of course, with broth, there's probably not one that has no added sugar, but you can compare to the other products that also have claims, nutrition claims like that, just to see, okay, is this really less sodium, and how much less sodium it is. So just be sure to look at your nutrition facts label with that. Okay, so we have our slow cooker here that has been cooking for a little more than 5 hours. I started it this morning and I let it cook until now. So I'm going to use my thermometer, and I'm just going to put it right down into this piece of meat here. And I'm gonna watch it go up and up and up. And I would carry it over there, but it's gonna drip. And it is going beyond 145. It looks like it is gonna stop at about 160. So the hotter that it gets, the more that that meat is gonna pull apart. So I'm just gonna transfer this to my clean cutting board here. So we know that our meat is thoroughly cooked. And I am going to use my tongs and this fork. And I'm gonna just kind of shred it a little bit. And it looks like it is coming apart very nicely actually. This is gonna be very tender. It's been sitting in that broth cooking. One thing with pork butt is it's a little bit tougher of a cut of meat, and that is why this recipe calls for it to be cooked in a slow cooker. If you can't find pork butt, pork shoulder is another option. Someone has emailed me about the recipe and that they couldn't find pork butt, and would pork shoulder work? Well, actually, they were saying that the butcher recommended pork shoulder, and yes, that will work just as well. And I always like to say too, whatever you have, you know, if you have things that you don't have to go out and buy, then use what you have. So this shredded really nicely. I did have my knife here just in case, because when I made this recipe before, there were a few pieces that were big chunks that didn't shred very well. So I had my knife handy just in case I needed to cut any of those big pieces up. And if you wanted to, you could take your knife to this and cut it a little smaller. Let's see, there's another big piece here. I'm gonna go ahead and shred that one a little more. But it looks like it's all shredded nicely. And this piece doesn't have, really, there's a little piece here of fat. The other piece that I cooked had a little bit more fat, and that's one good thing about shredding it outside of your broth. If there are pieces of fat, you can just take those off very easily and set it to the side. So there's just a little bit of fat there. But the rest of this, I'm just gonna add right back in to my broth in the slow cooker. Oh, here's another little piece of fat there. Just set that to the side. I don't want that in there. Don't need that. Okay. So I'm gonna set this over here, and I'm just gonna kind of mix that together. Right now, it kind of looks like a pulled pork because that's what it is. So I'm gonna pull this over here. I have a few more ingredients that I'm going to add. So the next ingredients, well, the next step, let's start there. We've shredded our pork into bite-sized pieces. We are now going to add garlic powder, tomatoes, kale, mustard, salt, pepper, and beans. So we have 2 tablespoons of garlic powder, which of course smells wonderful. A 14-ounce can of no salt added diced tomatoes. Now this, we've already talked about salt in cans, so the same thing that I talked about with broth applies to the tomatoes too. This particular brand of diced tomatoes says very clearly right here with a nice yellow dot, no salt added. And I can turn it over to the back and I can see that there is no salt in the ingredients. So I know that there's been no salt added. So I'm going to add this can of tomatoes in, and I'm going to leave the juice in there, okay? And then the next ingredient we have is 2 cups of chopped kale. So I have it here ready to go. Now, if you've ever bought kale, you know that if you buy it already chopped or if you buy it just the bundle, there's a lot of kale that comes with kale. So this recipe only calls for 2 cups. If you want to add more, feel free to add more here. But when you buy this kale, have a plan for what you're going to do with the rest of the kale. Maybe think about, is there another recipe that I make that I can just add some kale in to get some greens in? You can also use other greens. So if you had collard greens, or even if you had spinach or Swiss chard, you could use those as well. But because kale is a little bit thicker of a leaf than like spinach, you might want to add the other, if you're using a substitution for the kale, you might want to add that a little later in the cooking process. because your spinach isn't going to need to cook for as long as your kale is. Okay, the next ingredient is 2 tablespoons of Dijon mustard. I'm just going to scrape that in here. Smells very good. Over here. And then we have 3/4 teaspoon of salt. Now, when I was talking about the sodium and the tomatoes earlier, if for some reason your grocery store doesn't have no salt added or low sodium broth and or tomatoes, you may not need to add the salt. You might wait until you are serving it to taste it and see if it needs salt, because if you have tomatoes and or beans that have salt or sodium, excuse me, you might not need the salt. So I'm going to go ahead and add it in though, since I have no salt, tomatoes, and beans and broth. The next ingredient is a teaspoon of black pepper. And again, that's to taste. If you don't like pepper, you don't have to add it. If you want it a little spicier, you can add it a little more. I might add a little bit of red pepper flake to this just to give it a little bit more of a kick. Our last ingredient is 2 cans of cannellini beans. And same thing goes with the no salt added or low sodium. These are no salt added. Again, make sure to turn it around to the nutrition label to check and make sure that it really is no salt added. So 2 cans of these. If you cannot find cannellini beans are just a white bean. So a great northern bean would work. And if you already had maybe kidney beans or navy beans at your house, you can use those. It doesn't have to be the cannellini bean. I encourage you to be creative and make the recipe with what you have at home and what you like as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just stir this just a little bit. I'm not going to mix it all together completely, because as it cooks, of course, everything is going to kind of blend together. This isn't in the directions, but halfway through the cooking process, you might stop and stir it just to make sure that everything is combined. So the next step in the recipe is to let this cook for an additional hour. So we are going to do just that. And I'm going to push this back here. And through the magic of TV and Facebook Live here, ta-da, we have one that is already finished, that smells wonderful, and of course has been making the whole office hungry all morning. So this is our finished product, and you can see, let me tilt this a little bit so that you can see how much this makes. It makes quite a bit. So this is definitely enough to feed a family, or if you wanted to, save some for leftovers, of course. But I'm going to go ahead and plate this up. This in view, good. So that you can see here how colorful it is as well. It's very colorful. And the recipe, I'll be honest, I wasn't really sure how the recipe was going to turn out, because the picture looks like it's on a plate. I think it's probably in a bowl, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of broth. So with the broth, though, you can see that this is kind of like a stew, which is wonderful. But if you didn't want the broth, if you wanted, to serve it on a plate, that would certainly be fine. One thing that someone also asked, I don't have a slow cooker. Can I make this recipe at home still? And you certainly can. You can just do these steps, but in a stock pot over your stove. One thing, though, that would be beneficial in a slow cooker that you're not going to get on the stove in just a stock pot is because of the cut of meat that it is in this recipe, the butt, or if you use the shoulder. It's a tougher meat, and it does do better in the slow cooker. So if you do it over the stovetop, it's still going to take a little bit longer to make sure that your meat is tender, but you can certainly still do it over the stovetop. You just wouldn't cook it for 5 hours and then 1 hour. So part of the recipe for every month on the bottom page here with the actual calendar, it always has an option to make it a meal. So today, to make it a meal, we have applesauce, cornbread, and low-fat milk. One thing I want to mention, though, the recipe actually, or the suggestion actually says cinnamon applesauce. So I went to the grocery store and went to the applesauce section, found cinnamon applesauce, and flipped it over to the back. course, to look at the ingredients, and there was sugar added, as well as cinnamon and I think a couple other ingredients. So I looked at the other applesauces that were available, and I ended up choosing the one that said unsweetened applesauce. And the reason is because that's only apples. That was the only thing. Well, I take that back. I think there was ascorbic acid, maybe water, but there wasn't any added sugar. And it's kind of a marketing ploy that it says unsweetened applesauce, because there's just no added sugar. It's just regular applesauce. The other option was sweetened applesauce or regular. I think it said regular applesauce. Well, you think regular is the best kind, but regular means that they've added sugar. So I know I'm always talking about food labels, but I really encourage you to just notice what you're eating, notice the ingredients of some of the products that you eat, and just be familiar with how sometimes the marketing of a product can be a little tricky. I always like to say that the front of any product, what you see in the grocery store, is marketing. That's their commercial. The truth is on the nutrition facts label. So I encourage you to check that out. Are there any questions or any comments on Facebook that we have? I don't think so. All right, well, if you have any questions, you can contact me here at the Woodford County Extension Office. We will post the link to the recipe in the comments. And remember, if you would like to pick up one of these calendars at the Extension Office here in Woodford County or your local Extension Office, please stop by and we'll be happy to get one for you. We'll see you next month, the first Wednesday of May, right back here at noon. Thanks, everybody.